Well, welcome to The Crossing. So glad that you have joined us online today for this special series we're calling On the Run. I don't know if you've ever heard of mulligans, but if you haven't, you need to. Golfers, especially those who struggle on the course, if you're one of them, they swear by them. And the term originated from our friends to the north, the Canadians. A man by the name of David Bernard Mulligan, there you see it, a hotel owner and an avid golfer, was running late to his tee time one day with his regular foursome at a golf course in Montreal. When he got to the first tee, he hit a terrible shot, and in a fit of frustration, he placed another ball down and just quickly hit it again. His partners were obviously very confused, but they let him take the second shot. Mulligan dubbed it his correction shot, but his friends called it a mulligan, and the rest is history. We do that today. It became an unwritten rule in their foursome that a golfer could take a second shot on the first tee. And although it's not legal, the practice caught on, and now it's pretty commonplace. If you're a golfer today, you probably have done it. You've announced to your partner, I didn't like that shot, I'm gonna take a mulligan, and you hit it again from the same spot. There's actually a plaque that commemorates this moment at the St. Lambert Country Club. And golfers everywhere, and if that's you, you know it, we owe a debt of gratitude to David Bernard Mulligan. So it got me thinking, what if we could take a mulligan in other areas of our lives? Right? Like we get pulled over for speeding. What if we just were able to say, I'm gonna tear this ticket up. Thanks, officer, I'll be taking a mulligan today. Or the bank lets you know that you've overdrafted your account and you say, I'm gonna take a mulligan. You're in an argument and you say something you shouldn't. You call mulligan. You botch a test, you invest in the wrong company, you forget to send in your taxes, mulligan. We would all love the opportunity to have a mulligan, a do-over, a second chance, a repeat. And some of you right now, you're watching this, and the second chance you need is crucial. You need that second chance, maybe in your marriage. Maybe you've made some devastating decisions, or maybe you need a mulligan, a reset in your interaction with God. Life doesn't always give us these opportunities, but as we're going to learn in the story of Jonah, God often does. Now, I don't know how you feel about Jonah's story, but I think it's incredibly interesting. This entire series has been about what to do when you're headed or running in the wrong direction, and how do you navigate turning back around. And we've been looking at this story in the Old Testament of a man named Jonah, which is not a kid's story, though we often see it framed that way. So let me recap, first of all, the first two parts of the series, if you missed it, or as review, which actually consist of a chapter each. The story of Jonah reads a bit like a two-act play with two scenes in each act. And the last 2 weeks really has been act one, where in scene one, we find Jonah and he's receiving this clear calling and direction from God. And when he hears it, he doesn't want to follow. So he rejects it and he runs by going the opposite direction. That's act one, scene one. And because he runs, he finds himself in the middle of a storm of his own doing. And this storm doesn't just impact him, but it creates chaos for the people around him. And we should pause here, because don't we all know how true this is in our lives when we go in the opposite direction of God's direction, and how it unfortunately impacts everyone around us? But it's sort of humorous, because Jonah is on this boat and he's sleeping in the midst of this storm and chaos. And finally, the captain of the ship comes to wake him up. And Jonah admits, this is all my fault. And we've talked about how important over the last few weeks it is for all of us to wake up when we're going in the wrong direction, to wake up and be ruthlessly honest. And so in order to calm the sea, the sailors eventually throw him overboard. And last week, we looked at the second scene in Acts 1, which is probably the most famous part of this story, which involves Jonah being swallowed by and finding himself in the belly of a very large fish. It's ironic that Jonah was headed down to a city called Joppa to run away, and he was down in the bottom of the boat sleeping, and he ended up down in the fish's belly. He's in a real difficult situation. That's an understatement. And while he's there in the belly, he starts contemplating why he's ended up where he is. Not just the action, but the why behind his actions. And in the midst of his reflection, he actually does the right thing. He calls out to God. And in that moment, God responds and he rescues Jonah, which is where we left off last week with this verse. It says, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. What a picture. Which is not an awesome way to begin your morning. But Jonah reemerges, literally. He's gone through this terrible experience, but he emerges seemingly, we would hope, changed. Here's some ancient paintings of Jonah, which I thought were kind of unique, in that it's interesting that in these pictures, the artist would often put a halo around Jonah to represent, as he comes out of the fish and he's vomited out, this new enlightenment that he seemingly had from his experience in the belly of the fish. And then when this moment happens to Jonah, what we would say, he's given a mulligan or a second chance. And this is where we want to jump in today. In asking the question, have you ever been given a second chance? Somewhere in the narrative of your life, whether recently or further back, maybe in your childhood, in your career, in your marriage, but this second chance was significant to you. I mean, I've done some dumb things in life I'm not proud of, and I'm grateful for the people and the times in my life that I was allowed and given a second chance. Now, sometimes the things we do are dumb things, and sometimes those things are sin. They reflect a disobedience to God, and sometimes they're merely directional, where we're choosing our own will over God's. But either way, like me, you've messed up. You've gone the wrong direction somewhere in life, and maybe you've owned up to it at some point, and someone gave you a second chance, or better yet, maybe God gave you a second chance. We call that grace. But with every second chance, we have to also know that it always comes with elevated expectation. There is a hope when the second chance is granted, or assumption when it's granted, that the next time will not be like the last time. So the fact you've been given another go at it brings the hope that you're going to change, that you're going to adjust, you're going to behave differently. Actually, we would expect you to do that. You expect to do that. And our hope is with these elevated expectations, that there will be what we call a leveling up. Think of this like in gaming terms. If you're a gamer, you understand that there are different levels in any game. And we have a chance after we complete one level, we finally do it, we move to the next level, and we take all the experience and we take all of the learnings that we've previously been through, and that should help us as we go after this next level. That's the idea behind leveling up. So in Act 2 of this story, it begins with this second chance that Jonah receives as he emerges from the fish being vomited out. And the expectations are high, and the leveling up is hoped for. And here's how it begins in Jonah chapter 3, verse 1. It says, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Think of it as two paths happening here, God and Jonah, and they're interacting. And the words here are from the very beginning of this story, when in the beginning it said the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And in the first act of this story, Jonah decides to reject completely what God has wanting him to, and inviting him to do. And instead, in that moment when the word of the Lord came, he decided himself what was best for him. He made the choice that he thought was best for Jonah, despite what he clearly heard and knew from God. But now, because of God's grace, he's getting a mulligan. He's getting a second chance. And God comes to him again and says, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. God had already gave him the message he wanted spoken. It was the same message, because these people in Nineveh, they are wicked. They are violent, and God wanted them to be warned. God said, let them know that if they don't change immediately, that judgment and consequences are coming. Now, this was actually a primary role of a prophet. A prophet's role was to be the mouthpiece of God, to speak for God. And though we often think of a prophet as someone who provide maybe a future prediction, more often than not, it was actually a proclamation. Not a prediction of the future, but a proclamation. And these proclamations always warned of consequences if people did not get it together, change their direction, get in line with God, which is the kind of satirical irony of Jonah's story, because he needed to change direction. That's his story. And now he's going to be a mouthpiece to the people of Nineveh of exactly what he had experienced. And he didn't do it the first time, but now, because of his second chance, he's going to go to Nineveh and he's going to communicate on behalf of God. Now, keep in mind, as we've learned earlier in this series, Nineveh was a tremendous city in that area, in what is now northern Iraq along the Tigris River. It was an amazing ancient city. It was the largest city of all of the Assyrian Empire. This is way before Babylonia. This is way before the Romans. The Roman palace, we know, actually had about a 7.5-mile wall around it. It was a massive city. It was the New York City of its time. So in verse 3, it says, Jonah obeyed this time the word of the Lord, and he went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh, as we've learned, was a very large city. It actually took 3 days to go through the entirety of it. And Jonah began by going a single day's journey into the city. It's funny because I thought again of the idea of a mulligan. Oftentimes on the golf course, when we take them, the second shot is amazing. We have a saying, the guys that I play with, we say something like, the second shot, my second man would likely be on tour. It means every time we give 2 shots, if we were given 2 shots, we might be a pro. In this case, the second man on tour was Jonah in Nineveh, right? He's getting the actual message that Jonah proclaimed. And it's a bit different than what God actually told him. We're gonna read it. He stood on the street, and here's what he said. 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's his message. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Here's what I think of this. I think that this whole sermon is sus. That's right, as the kids would say. We should be suspicious of what's going on here with Jonah. He doesn't even go halfway into the city. He's barely in the city. And then he gives this lackluster sermon that in Hebrew is only 5 words. 5 Hebrew words, and it's an incredibly vanilla warning. It's not very strong. It's not very passionate. It's something terrible is going to happen, is what he said. And his attempt and his enthusiasm and his passion around communicating it, not very stellar. So here's Jonah. He gets his second chance, but there's some suspect perspective that we observe from him. And maybe think of my first sermon years ago. Not great. 1 page of scribbled notes. But it was not because of effort. It was because of the lack of execution. I was new to it. What's interesting from Jonah is there's not a hint of empathy as he casts this message out. There's no, take it from me, I've been in the belly of a whale, from his own personal experience. He's doing the absolute minimum to fulfill what God asked him to do, seemingly reluctantly. It's like he just showed up for his participation medal. Jonah shouldn't get a medal for this, but despite his pathetic message, look what happens. It's a terrible message, but it says when he spoke it, the Ninevites actually believed God, and a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Fasting means we turn down the noise. It's a time of pause. We cry out to God. We're turning down all of the distractions of our life. And the sackcloth that they put on represented this perspective and posture of confession and repentance, turning from our ways back to the ways of God. And so the Ninevites believed God, the God they didn't serve, and the God that Jonah didn't even mention in his stellar sermon. But there's more. It says this, when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, and this is where typically it would go sideways, right? Because kings didn't always take well when a foreign prophet would come in and start throwing out warnings about destruction and things, especially this king who may have been treated as though he were God, and now Jonah's saying, no, God is coming. But here's how this king of Nineveh responds. He says, it rose up from his throne at that moment. He took off his royal robes. He covered himself with sackcloth, so he joined his people, and he sat down in the dust. When the king heard the word of the Lord through Jonah, maybe second, third, or fourth hand, it got to him. And what does he do? He cast off everything, his robes that symbolize his power, and instead he puts on coarse sackcloth. He casts off everything that is his right, and he humbles himself, and he lowers himself all the way down to the dust. And verse 7 goes on to say, but by the decree of the king and his nobles, he said, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. We're fasting. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with the sackcloth. Then it says, let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows, the king said, God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. This was an all-scape. Everyone's in on it. Everyone, even the animals, the golden doodles. This is an issue where God, of free will, it's the way God created us. We're given the opportunity to turn around or not. And this nation is getting grace, and they're turning around. Not what we need, not what we deserve, but what we need. In verse 10, it says this: when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, their repentance and their fasting, he relented. And he did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. So God in his graciousness relented. They get their second chance. They get their mulligan. And in so many ways, Jonah is a foreshadow of who Jesus is. For us, Jesus entered the scene and said, in your life, there's not enough sackcloth. There's not enough fasting, but I am here to be the sacrifice for you. Jesus is the fulfillment of every longing that every Ninevite had. And they believed in faith. They didn't even know, but we can believe because we have more to the story. We have Jesus. We are unpacking the story with many of us already knowing the end. And that is so interesting. And we're going to be revealing the conclusion next week, if you could call it that, of Jonah's story. But regardless of whether you follow Jesus or not, or maybe you're watching right now and you're new to this concept of faith, we're all facing the opportunity for a second chance in various areas of our lives, be it our finances, our marriage, our parenting, our dating life. You may not be in the belly of a fish, but you realize right now you're listening and you're headed towards an undesirable direction. And you crave and you're longing for a turnaround. These past 2 weeks have taught us that the consequences that you're experiencing may be God's correction, but they are not God's rejection. God is continually nudging us towards course correction. He's helping us realize that we are experiencing correction, but he's not rejecting us as we navigate and are willing to turn around in our life. So what do we do? You're listening. What do we do with the second chances? What transformations do these turnarounds produce in us? Let me give you 4 thoughts as we wrap up today. Basically, a second chance, and what should our posture be in them? 4 of them. Here's number 1, gratitude. That as we lean into the mulligans that God gives us, we have to be grateful that we're not judged by the world's standards. It's not about you having a perfect image or status or job or bank account. You right now have grace and freedom and hope because of God's forgiveness if you'll lean in and what he's done. So our response, first of all, to this second chance should be that of gratitude. Secondly, our response should be humility. True repentance should really come from a place and should produce humility alongside that gratefulness we have. The prideful person is obsessed with themselves. It's all they think about. It's me, me, me. What's good for me? How am I viewed? How do I come across? How am I perceived? Because pride obsesses with self, but humility obsesses with others. How do I serve others? How do I love others? How do I encourage? How do I give? How do I comfort? And as a follower of Jesus, the journey is not about showcasing our awesomeness, but rather living life with an open hand, being humble and receptive to God's correction and embracing the new experience and growing and learning in him. Gratitude, humility, and then empathy. I love the word empathy. If gratitude and humility enable us to perceive others, they enable us to perceive them in this new light. Instead of seeing them solely for who they are, we catch a glimpse of their potential through Christ. Jonah missed that about the Ninevites. He never saw their potential. But we no longer view them as mere Ninevites, but as individuals with the capacity to change, for transformation to happen. And as a result, we develop empathy towards them because we've been, and we know we've been in their shoes before. Contrary to narcissistic grace, where we selfishly hoard it for ourselves, empathetic grace allows us to understand the struggle of others and actively participate in their journey towards a second chance. And then finally, after gratitude, humility, and empathy, it helps us discover purpose. A second chance should not be squandered on inaction. Jesus warns us against lighting a lamp and hiding it away. We respond to grace we've been given by realizing the true purpose of our lives. This newfound meaning we discover probably will lead us to approach our workplaces with renewed diligence and integrity, or maybe to open our homes to those in need. It may require us to confront some hard things that we've been avoiding. And listen, there are hard things. Here's a profound thought I want to warn you about. Sometimes doing hard stuff is always hard. Sometimes as Christians, we get confused. Sometimes I'm actually confused by our confusion as followers of Christ around the hard stuff. Because that's what Jesus calls us to, the hard stuff. He says, follow me even when it's hard. Jesus said, who's ever gonna follow me has to take up their own cross. And he's not talking about jewelry on a chain. He's not talking about bling. He's talking about taking up the cross and praying and giving generously of ourselves and our time and our resources. And these things can be difficult and painful. Yet despite this, Jesus calls us to follow him even when it's hard. It doesn't always feel good to do the things that Christ calls us to do, like go to Nineveh. And yes, yet we often wait until we feel ready. But the truth is, our lives have purpose. And sometimes that purpose requires us to lean into the hard and necessary work that God has called us to right now. So my question as we close today in this Act 2, Scene 1 of this Jonah story is, will you live with gratitude? Will you embrace the mulligans of your life with humility, with empathy, and with purpose? I trust that you will as you walk into your weeks this week. Let me pray for you today. God, thank you for this time that we get to spend relearning your story and how you operate. And God, seeing grace displayed through the story of Jonah. God, I pray for those listening today that perhaps they've doubted the second chance, let them step into it. Or perhaps they've rejected the second chance, let them embrace it. And God, I pray as well that we would accept the responsibilities and the expectation of those chances we've been given. We're grateful for it. We step into your grace this week. We ask these things in your name. Amen.
Well, thank you so much for joining us at The Crossing Online today. I just want to remind you, at our physical locations, Windmill, Midtown, and Highlands, we are in the middle of our At the Movies series, and that actually continues next Sunday. And so if you want to join us in person at one of those campuses so you can experience At the Movies, we would love to have you. But if you aren't able to join us in person, we will have another installment of our On the Run series as we are journeying through the book of Jonah together. Thank you so much for being here today, and have a great week.